Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. But not just another Tuesday live stream, a continuation of the Summer of Cscape. All summer long, we're bringing you great Cscape 10 related content, and today is no exception. Here's today's topic. Canvas recipes in Cscape 10. Also all summer long, I've been sharing with you some of my favorite summer activities, and today it's baseball. What could be better than a baseball game on a hot summer day? I'll tell you what, a Major League Baseball game at Wrigley Field here in Chicago. And what makes it better for me is that my Detroit Tigers, an American League team, are here playing the Cubs, which is a National League team. That makes this a pretty rare occurrence where these two teams will play in the regular season. Well, they also would be a rare occurrence for them to play in the World Series because neither team is doing so hot these days. Another reason this day is special is because today I got to enjoy 4 different summer activities. I left the house this morning in my convertible, with the top down of course. There's one. I headed to the train station and took Amtrak to Chicago. There's 2, I love riding trains, and packed aboard the baggage car was my bicycle. So I got to drive from Union Station on my bicycle to Wrigley Field. That's 3, love to ride my bike. And of course, the 4th is this great baseball game. Now you may be wondering, what did I do with my bicycle during the game? Well, Wrigley Field has that covered. They have bicycle valet parking. So I simply checked my bike, I'll watch the game. After the game's over, I'll reclaim my bike and pedal on back to Union Station. Okay, we need to go back to work. Let's go ahead and take a look at today's technical topic. All right, we're going to start with a quick review of the recipe functionality in non-canvas OCS models because that's really the baseline upon which that the canvas enhancements have been built. And then as we talk about the canvas recipes in Cscape 10, we're going to cover the recipe editor function, the recipe object. We'll also talk briefly about a couple of the logic blocks that remain for recipes in Cscape 10 that have been available for some time. And of course, there will be demonstrations throughout. Okay, let's start with our non-canvas recipe review with the recipe editor. So the recipe editor is a tool that allows recipes to be represented as a spreadsheet where the ingredients or process variables that are manipulated are rows and the products or the different combinations that result from the manipulation of the process variables or ingredients are shown as columns. And this spreadsheet is a CSV file that resides on the micro SD card at runtime. And there really hasn't been a lot of changes to the recipe editor between Cscape 9.9 and the non-canvas units and Cscape 10 and the canvas units. Okay, the next feature for non-canvas functionality has received a large number of changes. So with non-canvas units, the recipe object really isn't an all-encompassing object for creating a user interface for the operator, but it's a flexible object that you can place multiple instances of on the desktop as you kind of roll your own user interface for recipes. And you need to use that in combination with a series of data objects for representing your individual process variables or ingredients and showing those on the screen and allowing the operator to manipulate those. So frankly, there's a lot of work required for non-canvas units when you're talking about building a user interface that the operator can use to open recipes, save recipes, etc. Something that always has been available and continues to be available for recipe functionality are load and save function blocks available from Ladder. And those have been there since the beginning and they continue on with Cscape 10 and Canvas. Sometimes you want to load or save a recipe from logic and not necessarily depend on the operator. For example, you might want the operator to scan a barcode as he is getting ready to run a new product on the machine, and you would like logic to take the result of that barcode scan and automatically load the appropriate recipe. So that's an example where you might want to use those function blocks that continue to be available. Now we get into Canvas-specific enhancements, starting with the recipe editor. Now it looks very similar to what we see for non-Canvas units, except that we have added the ability in Cscape 10 for Canvas to add images for your individual ingredients and for your resulting products. So it's a little bit of a snazzy feature, but sometimes it makes sense for the operator to see something visually and not strictly depend on text. So the ability to add those images for ingredients and products has been added in Cscape 10 for Canvas. The real changes in Canvas from an enhancement standpoint is the recipe object, because now it is an all-encompassing object, which gives the system designer really a lot of functionality in a single object that they can configure flexibly for the specific functionality that they want their operator to have in regards to loading, saving, creating recipes, all those sorts of functions. So it has a ton of functionality as compared with the legacy recipe object, and let's dive into the details now. There are three main areas of the graphical recipe object. On the left-hand side is where the product list is displayed for the operator to make his selection. In the right middle is where you find all the ingredients, which of course are the process variables that are manipulated to create different products. And at the bottom right, you'll see all the built-in control buttons that are available to the operator depending on specifically the functionality that the system designer wants the operator to have. Looking at the details of the ingredients, you can see that for each ingredient, you have the ability to have a name, that optional image I was talking about earlier, as well as the value of that ingredient along with engineering units. If there are more ingredients that need to be displayed than the available space on the screen, then the operator will have the ability to scroll left to right through the list of ingredients. For displaying the products, there is a product list along the left-hand side, which again can be scrollable this time from top to bottom as the operator selects the product that he wants to work on. And then the upper right-hand corner has the currently selected product listed. Now let's go through the control buttons that are available in the new Canvas Cscape 10 recipe object, starting with the help button. This one's important because an operator may not remember what the functionality is for each of the other buttons, and by pressing the help button, they will get a pop-up message above each button that describes its functionality. There is an Open New Recipe File button that if the system designer chooses to provide to the operator, they'll have the ability to open up recipe files. And if they need to switch between recipe files, they can do that. There are a pair of buttons for viewing or loading a selected product, and another pair of buttons for adding or duplicating a selected product or for deleting the selected product. And then finally, there is a button that will allow the operator to save changes that they may have made to the selected product. And remember, the system designer has the flexibility to include or not include any of these buttons in the functionality for the recipe object he is configuring for the application. And the recipe object configuration dialog is where those decisions are actually configured as to which buttons to include, what functionality to include in the particular recipe object. And without further delay, let's dive right into the demonstration for the Canvas recipe object. Okay, let's create a recipe from scratch. I've got a brand new project here, completely blank. At some point, we're going to have to create a new screen. So I'll go ahead and do that up front. So I go to User Interface, Main Screen Group here, right-click, hit New Screen. I'll just call it Recipe 1. Okay, and there we go. So I've got a new screen, completely blank. And let's take a look at how we create a recipe. Okay, so there's two different parts to creating a recipe. There is creating a recipe database, and then there is placing the recipe object on the screen so the recipe database can be accessed by the operator at runtime. So we're going to start with the recipe database, which can be found from the home section here. Under data, there's recipe database. Okay, so when you first load it up, when you have no recipe databases existing, you need to, or this is what you're prompted with. So let's give this a name. This is just an English name. Let's see, let's just call it Paint Database. There we go. And the file name, I'm just going to give it a name like Paint Test. Well, actually, one thing to keep in mind, the file name for the recipe database does need to be an 8.3 format. So let's just call this Paint 1. We can call it whatever we want. .csv. Oops, not CSP, CSV. There we go. And this is where we need to set the number of recipes and the number of ingredients. So ingredients is how many program variables are we going to have that we're going to be modifying and changing the configurations of, or changing the values of, to make different combinations of products. So let's say that we're going to have up to 16 ingredients. We can add them again later. That can be done, but let's say we've got 16 ingredients. And then in terms of number of recipes, this is where you would set the number of combinations you're expecting to have. So in my case, if I'm doing paint, maybe I'm going to expect I could have up to 128 different combinations of paint that I could be making here in this application, right? So I'm going to change up to 16 process variables. In those combinations, there's going to be up to 128 of those combinations. Okay, so I'll say okay. And it brings up this spreadsheet here where the ingredients are across the top, and there would be 16 of those. Okay. And the recipes are in the rows, and there are 128 of those. And by default, you know, they're just named item 1, item 2, item 3, recipe 1, recipe 2, recipe 3. Okay. So every ingredient across the top is going to be tied to a process variable in the application. So when we click on this to configure it, we give it a name. All right, let's say, again, I'm doing paint. Let's say that one of my ingredients is white pigment. All right, and I'm going to tie that to a variable in my program. Let's say I've got a variable called white pigment. It could be called anything, but I'm saying there's one called white pigment. And let's say it's a decimal value of in percent, maybe it's in some sort of volume percent. And we'll create it like this. So 3 digits, so that's up to 100%. We're going to allow the operator to change it in the field if we want him to. Okay, and they can set it to a value between 0 and 100. Okay, and then finally, we have the ability to add a picture, a little thumbnail picture to it if we wish. And I've created some thumbnail pictures. So from my images and fonts folder, I've got a paint graphics folder, and let's go ahead and pick this graphic that I've created for white pigment. Okay, so I've now completely configured this particular ingredient. Because I'm creating my variables on the fly, I'm getting this message here. So we'll just go ahead and finish creating that. Okay, if I had created the variable in advance, I wouldn't have gotten that message. Okay, so that's how we're going to configure each of our ingredients across the top. Okay, and from a recipe down the side here, this is what we're calling the different combinations. So maybe this one is going to be white paint. Oh, we don't need a space there. This is just English words. Okay, so maybe this is white paint. And we have the ability to put a little thumbnail graphic for that as well. So I've created one here, or several here, as you can see. And now we've got that. So these are the different combinations. And for white paint, what are the values going to be of all our different ingredients? You know, we're going to have white pigment, I would guess, here. And then depending on what we do with the other ingredients, we'll have some values there as well. So that's what this is. Now, you don't have to do all the editing here. Okay, you could export this particular basic form of the spreadsheet now. Okay, that's something you could do. So you can go to export data here, and it'll export a CSV file, which you could then edit in Excel, right? and, set all the ingredient names and set the recipe names and all that sort of thing, set all the values for each recipe, how much of each ingredient they have, in the columns or in all the different cells, and get that all fully configured and then import that in. So if you export it out and then import it back in again, everything's going to go nice and smoothly, and then you can choose to do your editing there. Now, ultimately though, even after you if you edit it in Excel and bring it back in, ultimately you're still going to have to go into each of the ingredients and configure the ingredients. What it really does for you is configures all the recipes and all the cells. So you have to use the database editor for things like editing the individual ingredients, putting this data in here. You can't do that externally in Excel. And then you also have to, from a graphic standpoint, you'll get the names back in as you name each of these recipes, but if you have graphics for each of them, if you choose to use that feature, then you'll need to use the database editor here to add those graphics in. So that's the tools that are available for you when you're creating your recipe database. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close this here. Okay? And then I'm going to go to this screen and I'm going to set up the recipe object the operator can use to actually manipulate the recipe. So the way we do that is we go to Touch Objects and Recipe Editor Functions. Click on that. Drag that guy. All right, and then we can size him up. Okay, and let's go ahead and do that now. All right, and as you can see here, we haven't named all of our ingredients, but the one we did name, we've got a name and a graphic for. Okay, and we've also got the format for the data that we're looking at here. So this is our default settings for our recipe editor for the operator. Let's go in and see what changes we can make to that by double-clicking on it. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is set the default recipe name. I've only got one recipe database created, so it's on the list here, and I named it PaintDB. Now, if you want to show a list of recipes along the side of the object, you click this here, and then all the available recipes are shown here kind of in a spinner where you can scroll up and down through the list of possible recipes. All right. And you can configure what your ingredient columns widths are. If you choose, you can tweak that a bit. And then you can decide what functions you want your operator to have available to them at runtime. Do they need to have the ability to add a new recipe? So if they've got an existing recipe and they want to create a new one that's similar to it, then you may want to give them the capability of adding a recipe, which is a good idea. You may or may not want to give them the ability to delete a particular recipe. Loading a recipe, you would definitely need, unless you're going to do all your recipe loading from Logic, because you can do that. You can load recipes from Logic. There's a load recipe function block. And then do you want to give them the ability to click on a recipe and view it without loading it? So in other words, if they're interested in knowing, okay, what are the settings for this particular recipe, and I want to look at those settings for all the ingredients without actually loading it into the application, loading it on the screen, but not loading it into all the variables that are tied to those ingredients, then that's what View Recipes does. And then there's Save, Save As, and then Open Recipe. Open Recipe is really useful, and I'll show that in our runtime demo, because you could have several different recipe databases that are all accessible by this one recipe object, and the operator could flip back and forth. What that's good for is if you've got a lot of recipes, you might want to categorize those and have a bunch of smaller recipe databases instead of one ginormous one, which might be easier for the operator to navigate through. So you can keep all the ingredients the same if you choose, and then just have different recipes depending on what categories those are. So in the case of my paint, I could have an oil paint, a water paint, an acrylic paint, different databases if I want, or I could have one big database with all the paint combinations in it. So there we go. So that's a good start in terms of the configuration there. And then you can, the default background is just gray, but you can do some different things with your background. Like all Cscape 10 graphics objects, you can use a pattern, you can use whatever color you choose, you can use a gradient, you can even use a user image, although that may not be as applicable to this object as it is to some. Okay, so we'll just leave that at gray for now. All right, so that's what it now looks like. Let me go ahead and stretch this down a little bit smaller and then slide it out so you can see the complete object. Okay, because remember we added on the recipe selection over here. So here's the recipes that can be scrolled up and down at runtime. Here's the recipe that's quote unquote currently selected. And then here is the currently selected ingredients, or I'm sorry, I accidentally clicked on that. The values of the ingredients and the format that we've selected along with the buttons underneath that. Now I know I just created this project. I'm just gonna close it down, okay, and not save the changes. I just wanted to show you how to load a recipe or create a recipe from scratch. Now I'm gonna actually load up more or less a finished project that has more details filled in to the recipe. So let's go ahead and head back to user interface, main screen, recipe 1. Now you can see I've fully configured this recipe object on the screen with a complete listing of recipes, and I've included the recipe selector here in the object. I've also got a complete set of ingredients, and you'll notice that the list of ingredients kind of scrolls off the screen. So at runtime, you'll be able to scroll through those left to right to see those. And of course, these are our different operators that we can execute here. So let's double click and take a look at the configuration that I did for this particular object. And as you can see, I did also do a special background, kind of a metallic brushed aluminum type look on the background. So that was the configuration there. And then if we take a look at the recipe database here, we'll see that I've created several actually. I have one called oil paint, which has all my ingredients and all my recipes for the different oil paint combinations. And then with the recipe editor, I can scroll through multiple databases if I've created multiple databases. All right, so I'll do that now. So this is a paint all types, all-inclusive database. I've also got one for acrylic combinations, and I've got one for watercolor combinations. So this was the approach I took, which was to kind of fully flesh this feature out, use graphics everywhere. You don't have to use those. If you don't use them, that's fine. The ingredients and the recipes show up by name, but you know, it snazzes it up a little bit to have the graphics included there. And so that's kind of the basic setup that I've done for this particular demo application. And the next thing we'll do is take a look at this demo application running on the bench so we can see what things look like at runtime. Okay, so here's our recipe object here on the screen. On the left is the list of all the available recipes that are available to us. Okay, and I believe I've got I think this is I'm not sure which database I've got here. It's either the all database with all the paint choices, or it's just the oil bases. So I can probably scroll down here and see if we ever get past so this is the all database. So it's got 36 different choices in terms of paints. Okay, now the one that is currently selected, okay, is shown up here at the top. So if I want to change to magenta and take a look at magenta, then that'll be shown as selected up here. Now, it isn't necessarily loaded though, because unless the little loaded icon is shown in the right-hand corner, it's not loaded. Which one is, how do I actually load it? Well, let's take a look here. At the bottom, we have a series of icons which the operator can press to do certain actions. Now, which button does what? It may be hard to remember that. So we have this help button, which can be used to show the specific functionality for each of the buttons. What does that button actually do? Okay, so that's really useful. Okay, so if you were paying attention there, you probably saw that this is the load button. So if I press the load button, it's going to ask if I want to load the recipe that's selected. I say yes, okay. And now magenta is selected and loaded because you can see that little icon there in the corner. Okay, so what else could we possibly do here? Well, one of the things we might want to do is load a different recipe database. Maybe we have several different recipe databases available to us and with different categories of things we could run on this machine. In my case, it's different types of paint. So let's go ahead and load a different database. Maybe I'm going to be doing 6 or 7 acrylic paints, and I want to just have the acrylic paint database pulled up so it's easier to navigate through. So if I take a look again at the help file and see what each of these buttons do, we'll see when we get to the end there that opening a new recipe database or a different recipe database is this button right here. So I'm going to press that. It's showing me that Paint All is currently what's selected. I can hit this button here to look at all the choices. I'll go ahead and pull up Acrylic and say OK. And now only the recipes that are included in this particular database will be shown. I don't have to go through all 36. Only the 12 in this category are available here. And only the ingredients that are relevant to acrylic are going to be shown as well. That's based on how I've set it up, at least. And you can see we can scroll left to right to see what's off the screen if necessary in terms of an ingredient standpoint. So that can be very helpful, loading a new database. What if we want to create a new recipe, for instance? Okay, so let's say I want something that's blue, all right, but similar to blue, but not exactly the same. I want to tweak that one a bit. So what I'm going to do is create a new recipe, and that's the first button here. And so what it does is it makes a copy of the currently selected one, adds it to the bottom, and I have the ability to rename this if I want. You know, maybe what this is a special combination code or something. Maybe this is blue acrylic number 123, okay, that I'm creating here. Okay, so I've renamed it right here from the screen, and I can go in here and tweak it. Maybe what makes this blue special is that we use a little less of the blue pigment, and we tweak in a little bit of yellow. Maybe that's what we do here. Okay, let me hit the right spot. Okay, and maybe that's the new combination that we've got there. And since I've made this change, if I want it to be downloaded, I'm going to have to load it. Okay, so I've done that, and you can see effectively my changes that I made here have been loaded to the individual ingredients, and that's shown here. Now if I want this to be a permanent change, though, I need to save it. So I believe the save button is right there. So I hit the save button. Okay, do we want to save our changes to our recipe database? It's telling us, hey, there's a file already there. I'm going to go ahead and overwrite it. I could have chosen to create a new recipe database instead, for instance. So hopefully this gives you a good idea on how the recipe object works at runtime. Okay, that does it for our technical content for today. This is a reminder that we're here just about every week, Tuesday at 2 o'clock. If you'd like to join us live, we've always got someone standing by to answer your questions. And if you watch on replay like a lot of you do, we'd love to see your comments and questions in the comment section, and we'll get back to you with answers just as fast as we can. Don't forget to sign up for training. Only a couple classes left in 2024. Don't miss out. Also, don't miss the opportunity to see us at IMTS, the Machine Tool Show at McCormick Place in Chicago. It's a rather long show, lasts for about a week. You've got a chance to talk to myself, and better yet, key people from Horner, including Casey Gardner, our product manager, maybe even Phil Horner, our owner. So don't forget to join us, or don't miss this opportunity starting September 9th. There are also lots of ways to interact with Horner online, including our website at hornerautomation.com, our YouTube channel where you'll find this and hundreds of other videos, as well as LinkedIn. Now next week, we've got a great topic for you, and that is WebMI Plus for Canvas in Cscape 10. WebMI is our remote control and monitoring functionality that's been enhanced with Canvas and Cscape 10. Don't miss that next week. Okay, that's it from Wrigley Field. It was a wonderful day, although my Tigers, not so good. That grand slam in the second inning was a rough way to start. But I had a spectacular time, and I've still got a bike ride, a train ride, and a convertible ride back home. It's going to continue to be a great day. Until next week, and the last Summer of Cscape episode, let's get out there and catch a ball game.